Hello, everyone. My name is Ray Massey. I'm an ag business and policy extension economist here at the University of Missouri. And actually, I've looked at who's currently watching this program, and several of you I've talked with already. So I want to just start out, since you already know, several of you know me already. Please interrupt. Write something in the chat box, and I'd love to just interact with you. But this is the final of our 10 seminars on leasing. And what I'd like to do is look at incorporating conservation practices into a farm lease. And in the process of doing that, I will be just referring to a lot of information we've already learned. And so it's kind of a review or perhaps an application of some things we've learned to incorporating conservation practices. So let's get started. First off, if I can get there we go. So I've done some focus group activities with non-operating landowners and asked why do they own land? And they have these 6 reasons here. They own land because they don't want to or can't farm it themselves. They own it as a source of income. They own it because they want to pass it on to a family, leave it a legacy, have a family togetherness. Some just enjoy the farm. They want to visit, they want to work on it, they want to hunt on it. Some have a concern for the land. They want to improve the soil or the trees or the environment of it. And some have a concern for tenants. And if you look at those, I've highlighted some things that would cause them to actually want a conservation practice on their land. If they're wanting to leave a legacy, that means they're wanting to leave something they're proud of. And frequently having conservation on the land is something you can be proud of. If they are wanting to enjoy the farm, they're wanting to go out there and see the beauty of it, to see the wildlife, to see the crops growing, not to see the erosion on it. And so they're going to want some conservation if they're going to enjoy it. If they do have a concern for the land, they just want to leave it better, they want to conserve it, they want to improve soil organic matter or reduce erosion. Again, they'll be concerned about conservation practices. And then some people say that they're interested in keeping long-term tenants or long-term relationship. And actually conservation practices go with long-term tenants. So we're going to look at these and see how they might affect conservation practice adoption. But in order to understand conservation practice adoption, we want to look at 4 barriers that have been identified to incorporating conservation into leases. And the 4 barriers are lease terms, lease information or information deficits about conservation and leasing, information unevenness, and I'll define that when we get to it, and then interpersonal or cognitive barriers, just things that are unique to almost any activity. So let's look at these 4 barriers in a little more detail. But before we do that, something we talked about earlier is negotiation. If you're wanting to incorporate a conservation practice and the other party doesn't seem interested in it, it's important to recognize negotiation is not a battle, but a process of discovery. Asking questions, finding out what the other person is interested in, finding out what their resources and their constraints and their limitations are, and moving forward with different ideas and discovering ways in which both parties' objectives can be met. So I think that's key to understanding as we look at some changes in leases, and particularly long-term changes like conservation practices. But the first barrier was lease terms, and that would be lease length, lease type, and rental rate. And I want to look at each one of those individually. So let's look at lease length. So across the bottom here, it's the number of years that the tenant has managed a piece of land. So this is a new tenant on a piece of land, 1 to 3 years, going all the way to a tenant that has had that same piece of land for greater than 20 years. The interesting thing is the new tenant is likely to get an annual lease, meaning it renews and is renegotiated or maybe renegotiated, but probably just renewed every year. But even the person that has a 20-year lease, over 65% of those tenants that have been farming the same piece of ground for 20 years have an annual lease, meaning every year they may lose the land. And so if they don't have that confidence that they'll keep the land, they may be less interested in conservation. And so it does beg the question of why do we have annual renewals when we have tenants that have been farming it for 20 or 11 to 20 years, long time. And some people you can see are beginning to have 4 or more years in a lease. So it's not uncommon to have a long-term lease, long-term being greater than 4 years here. But over here, these guys could have had 5-10-year leases and not had any problems with it. A longer term lease does need to be written so that everybody understands how it would change over time, particularly the lease rate. And so let's go on from there and say, how would I adopt a longer lease? First, you need to be able to maintain trusted tenants if you're a landowner, and the tenant needs to have a good enough relationship with the landowner, trust him. But in the process, as you write a long-term lease, you want to put ways of getting out of a longer-term lease. So what happens if you want to sell the land, if you have the death of one party, if the tenant's not maintaining the land in a particular way, you can put terms that would get you out of a long-term lease. And at the bottom here is an addendum that Iowa State has. You can find it in the Canvas site that we've been using for this particular class. But it's an addendum that tells you if this happens, then this will be the way that we exit this lease. And for example, they say, if I put in grass waterways, if I'm the tenant and I put in grass waterways, and those are expected to last 10 years, and that I lose the lease after 5 years, then the landowner would compensate me for about half the value of those that grassed waterway, because I did not benefit from it for the full 10 years. So those types of things can be done. I'd go to the Canvas site and you'll be able to find this along with some other resources. The other thing besides a longer term lease is a cash lease versus a crop share lease. A cash lease is not as likely to have long-term lease conservation activities involved in it. And that's because a share lease shares both the expense and the benefit of conservation practices, whereas a cash lease, it's not quite as obvious about that. And so as I've talked with focus groups, landowners, they're hesitant to go to a crop share lease because they don't necessarily understand farming. They may have inherited the land, they may have been away from it for the last 10 years, and they recognize things have really changed with technology and whatnot. So there's some hesitancy to move to a crop share. They may not know what's legitimate and customary as far as splits and who pays what and when they pay. But all of that was covered in our session on crop shares. But they may actually need a farm manager or farm management company that would come in and help out if they move to a crop share. And that will cost money. So that is a valid concern when we're talking about conservation adoption or conservation practices. Let's look at the history. So the top bar here is Iowa State University survey of Iowa farmers. And back in 1982, 50% were crop share and 50% were cash rent. In 2017, which is 25 years later, we have less than 20% are crop share. And the bottom bar is Missouri. My research in 2021, it says just under 25% are crop share. So we have moved toward cash rent, and that could be a hindrance to conservation practice adoption, but it can be overcome with just smart leasing. And so why is a cash rent less optimal for conservation? And it could be that the rental rate may limit the ability of the tenant to adopt conservation practices. The tenant's focused on meeting cash flow today, not on investment. And conservation typically is considered an investment. So you can overcome that in some ways by the landowner valuing the non-cash contribution of the tenant, meaning recognizing whether the tenant is actually improving the quality of the land and resources that are there. And if you do that, it may lower the rent and they may be more inclined to incorporate conservation activities. And then also research has shown that about 20% of landowners have expressed a willingness to pay for some of the cost of cover crop adoption. So if you're a tenant, I really encourage you to not assume that the landowner is not going to help out. You need to have a conversation with them about that and how that could be followed through. So one of the questions that would impact the amount of rent, because you want to lower it maybe to get a conservation adoption, is what percent of the income does the landowner have from leasing? So the Iowa State Survey on top shows that Iowa farmers, about 65% of their farmers have less than 50% of their income from rent. In Missouri, my research has shown about 80% have less than 50% of their income from rent. And so it's not their major source of income, and they may be willing to subsidize or lose some of that rental rate in order to have a long-term investment. On the other hand, if you're looking at the blue and the red, where people are getting more than 50% of their income from rent, in the blue 75%, they may be a little more hesitant to shift some of that away, depending on how much money they do get from rent and their need for it. But that is important in this. So let's look at the barriers to adoption. Number 2, information deficit. So what are the reasonable practices? What are the resources available? And do you trust those sources of information? So first off, what practices are reasonable? We have here about 30 different practices. Cover crops is right there close to the top and in big print because that's what everybody's talking about. But conservation, tillage, nutrient management, filter strips, rotational grazing, streamside fencing, all of these are conservation practices that the NRCS recognizes and would perhaps help depending on the environment that your land is in. But not everyone works for every piece of land, and not everyone would be appropriate for every piece of land. And so a farmer that knows the land and is comfortable with these things would say, oh, those are the ones I want to emphasize. Another person might not know which one is most appropriate. And so they have what we call an information deficit. They'll need to get information on which ones would help their land. So the first thing is their experience with farming. So I want to really draw your attention over here to the right-hand side of this graph, the orange. Because in the orange is landowners in which they or their spouse have neither farmed the land. Somehow they have acquired land that they have no history with. And that can be anywhere from 10% for Iowa to 25 or almost 30% for Kansas and Illinois. By the way, we don't have Missouri data for this. But those people probably would not have a good idea of what kind of conservation practice to put on the land. Whereas if we're looking at the green side, I have operated the farm, they are probably going to have a good idea of what to put on the land. And then in between for the red and the blue. So you need to understand who's working, who the landowner is. Then for sources of information, we have multiple sources, the United States Department of Agriculture, particularly the NRCS, but we also have state departments of agriculture, State Department of Conservation. And I want to draw attention to the State Department of Conservation, because in Missouri, they do have a landowner resource in our State Department of Conservation, where they actually will send people out to your land to help develop conservation plans. And on our website, the Canvas site again, we have a link to where you can find that. But there's also soil and water conservation districts. There's private trust, and these private trusts will try and help preserve farmland, or they may try and help preserve species. So they're trying to look at just different species that need help, and they might help you with the conservation plan. And there are others. But one of the big things is this trust in information, or the politicalization of science is occurring, where people say, well, that's your science, not my science. And it used to be, and it's supposed to be, where science is research-based, reproducible information. And so there's just this question. And so the next question is, does the advice, or I'm going to go to the third one. Do landowner and tenant agree on the information source? So do you both trust the same piece of information? I would really encourage you to try and just state where you're getting your information if you're trying to convince one or the other to move in a different direction, so that they can look at that and see whether or not it's trustworthy. And if you're looking for advisors, like the previous slide, the NRCS, the Department of Conservation, Trust, and actually Extension Office, do they have the latest technical knowledge? Are you convinced that they have good knowledge? And again, ask them for their sources. And the one thing that long-term decisions do require is a trust in information. So you need to be able to trust what each of you are trying to get done. I'd mentioned that we talked about agsite.missouri.edu earlier, but we talked about it as just drawing a boundary around the land and using that to tell people what land that they're actually renting. But if you do go to agsite.missouri.edu and draw a boundary around your farm, there's a button that says create report. And that report actually has a lot of conservation concerns for a piece of land, such as waterways, floodplains, any type of habitat for wildlife. And so beside each table in that report, there's a button that's called information. And if you click that information button, it will bring you to different sources of information that will help you understand that particular conservation issue. So agsite.missouri.edu is a place you might want to continue to look at. Then the third barrier is information unevenness, or what we would call asymmetry. But it's where the tenant who controls the farm has some information that the landowner doesn't. Or the tenant is familiar with local conditions and the landowner is not. I particularly have that problem now because I'm managing my in-laws' land up in Montana, and I do not understand the conditions up there. And so I'm having to rely upon a lot of helpers. And then the landowner has plans for the land that the tenant may not understand, and therefore they're not communicating. They're talking over the top of each other, which is what this information unevenness is. So part of the biggest way to resolve this is to select a good tenant. And once you've got a great tenant, these things seem to work themselves out a little more easily. But one of the questions that always arises, and we've talked about it already, is rental rate. How important is it to you? How important is it to the tenant, the landowner? And then, do you have confidence in the integrity of the landowner or the tenant? And then recognizing what services a tenant provides to the landowner, whether it's maintenance of land, improvement of land, communication of what's happening, just recognize all of those things. So here's an illustration of how important it is to be aware of conservation practices. So this is for non-operating landowners, people that do not farm anymore. And if it's a permanent conservation practice, about 10% of them are involved in making the decision for a permanent conservation. If it's a one-season conservation, such as cover crops or no-till, only about 5% are involved in making that decision. Now, if I come down here this top thing is the same non-operating landowners, the 10% and the 5%. But over here, there's operating landowners or operating landlords. And those are people that are continuing to farm and they have another piece of land that they're renting out to somebody for some reason. But notice that this 10% all of a sudden jumps up to 28%. And the 5 jumps up to 15%. In other words, landowners who are operating land know the conservation practices that are legitimate, have sources of information. They're willing to become more involved in those decisions. So why? Well, it's really what we call transaction cost. And a transaction cost is really a non-cash cost, such as time, information gathering, negotiations. And if one party wants to do conservation, then the other party needs to reduce that transaction cost as much as possible for the other. So here's a quote that for many farmers, the transaction cost, and those are the non-cash costs, induced by the non-price attributes, conservation, are a more important driver of willingness to accept a contract than the cost of adopting the environmental practice. In other words, they may pay to adopt the environmental practice, but that's only if they can get over the hump of understanding and gathering information and negotiating. So the party who wants to adopt a conservation practice needs to minimize the transaction cost by gathering the information, presenting a plan, and going it with the conversation from there. So the last one, barriers to adoption, interpersonal and cognitive barriers. I have geographic distance, gender, and age. I'm actually going to start with gender because what we find with gender is that male tenants weigh the cost of not following prescriptions in a fixed rent contract. So that we're talking about fixed cash when they work with female owners, and they may disobey female landowner prescriptions more than male landowner prescriptions, meaning it doesn't always occur, but the male tenant may disregard the female landowner more than they would disregard a male landowner. And so that needs to be understood and guarded against from both the tenant and the landowner side. But one of the results that the research shows is that female landowners may offer a discount more than landowners would offer a discount. So they're not going to get paid as much, or they'll pay more to have conservation done. Just recognize that and try to fight against that, that problem. But then let's go on to age and rent. So aging landowners are more dependent on rental income, but heirs are less dependent on rental income usually. It's not always the case, but if they're less dependent on rental income, the heirs may be more willing to make some dollar concessions, but the older landowners who are familiar with the land may be more able to make conservation decisions. And then absentee landowners are more likely to own land for amenity reasons, which would encourage them to do conservation. But heirs frequently have environmental or conservation ideas of their own. So there are some differences in age and whether or not they're interested in conservation and how much money they take for rent, but it's something that you really need to explore. So what we've looked at is that there's 4 barriers that have been identified for conservation adoption. Those are the lease terms, the lease information deficits, information unevenness, and interpersonal or cognitive barriers. And I would just say that what I've tried to do over the last 25 minutes here is say those really occur in any type of lease negotiation, but the conservation brings it out because of its long-term nature. So I'm going to stop there. And I do have one question, it looks like. I think it's only one question here. And it says, if a landowner looking for a tenant who values conservation practices, if I am a landowner looking for a tenant who values conservation practices in their farming operations, where do I find them? How do I ask the right questions to make sure we're in alignment? You know, that's a great question because finding a tenant is always a difficult thing. So we actually recommend interviewing tenants. And so you can make it known to farmers that you're interested in having somebody rent your land. But historically, what's happened is people look for the highest rent. Well, which one's going to pay me the most? And if you are looking for a tenant who values conservation, that will be the question that you ask instead of which one pays me the most. Now, it doesn't mean that you're not going to make as much money, but what it means is you're going to value the investment activity of a conservation practice and how that makes you money in the long term. So again, I don't know of any place that you can just advertise, I'm looking for somebody that has a conservation. But let me back up. Again, the Department of Conservation landowner services is actually quite impressive here in the state of Missouri. So you might actually ask the Department of Conservation if they have some landowners in your area. Again, it's going to be very localized, but if you have them out to look at ways to conserve your land, to improve its environmental amenities, they may have some neighbors that they have worked with that would be able to help out with that. So, and are there other questions that anybody has? Oh, so what are the most common types of conservation practices you've seen implemented in lease agreements in the last 5 years? That's kind of an interesting question because the one that is always talked about is cover crops. And so that's the one that I have seen implemented the most in the last 5 years is cover crops. I'm not sure it's the one that's implemented the most though. There are a lot of leases where the grass waterways, the riparian zones, even no-till activities, no-till practices have been mandated in leases. And the reason I say 5 years versus what's most common is no-till is something that's been around for 30 years or so. And so it's been incorporated, and a lot of leases will actually specify no-till except under certain conditions or things of that nature. Other leases will specify, hey, we need to have a rotation or things of that nature. But within the last 5 years, I'd have to say it is conservation, or not cover crops. I've got one more question here. As a beginning farmer, how do I know which conservation practice is most suitable for my farmland? Again, if I'm wondering whether that's from the tenant or the landowner perspective. So if I'm a beginning farmer, I think of it as from the tenant. What the tenant's going to want to look for is practices that will have a long-term benefit to his bottom dollar. So we just recognize eroded land does not produce as well as non-eroded land. So a cover crop may be very good, but cover crops might not work if the land actually needs to have some terraces put in or have a grass waterway. So they're going to be more interested in those which yield a true benefit to yields and production right now. If you're the tenant, you're looking for improving your yields. And so that's what I would say is the most important conservation practice. And I might just mention there are a lot of conservation practices that can help a tenant. For example, I've done some studies on split nitrogen application. And split nitrogen application really does have the potential to reduce the cost of nitrogen without reducing the yield. But there are some issues about the equipment needed and timing and things of that nature. But you might also go to your extension office and say, what's common around here? What could I do to help out here? And I see no further questions. And it is 7:31. Is there? So I guess I will adjourn here. I want to say one thing before we leave. Within the next couple of days, I am going to send out a survey instrument and evaluation, and I really would appreciate you just telling us what you benefited from, what you think needs to be improved. And there's questions also about how to present this type of information. So you'll be getting that in the next couple of days. I appreciate you guys holding with us for these 10 weeks. Thank you. Goodbye.